Thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you and good morning, everybody. As just said, I represent here Accord, which I joined recently as a senior advisor. Before that, I have worked for the OAU, African Union, and then the United Nations. At the AU and the UN in particular, I have learned how issues are closely related to each other. For instance, although I have been dealing essentially, both at the AU and the UN, I have been dealing essentially with issues of peace and security, I found myself dealing with gender issues because we came to acknowledge the fact that women is an important factor in peace-building efforts. But I found myself also deeply involved in issues of environment, especially from the angle of natural resources and their impact on conflict. So you see how issues are related, and we have mentioned that during our discussions yesterday. I have also learned that despite differences, this kind of organizations, like a regional organization like the African Union and the United Nations, which is a universal platform, is a unique platform that brings together different countries with different interests, but we are able within these organizations to promote common agenda and build consensus. So I have realized the relevance of these regional organizations and, of course, the United Nations, despite differences between countries. But I have also realized the limits as much as this forum provide useful tools for working together, living together. At the same time, they have their own limitations. And somebody yesterday was saying that you should not rely on the UN Security Council to achieve this kind of goals that we are pursuing, the climate change. Their action is very often made difficult by a number of factors. One of them is, of course, the main important is the issue of sovereignty, and it was also referred yesterday. The sovereignty member states, they agree together within the UN, with the regional organizations, but at the end of the day, they are sovereign and they can decide whatever they want for their own countries. I have seen also the weight and the pressure exerted by individual of interest group that have their influence in the decision-making that sometimes undermine the decision-making at regional organizations and the United Nations. These factors have impact on the issue of collective responsibility and collective governance. We have been seeking collective responsibility and collective governance. That's why we want to be governed together, to share our destiny together. We want institutions at in the universal level, the UN, and regional level, the AU and others like the EU and others, to bring us together, to keep us together. So we want that, we call for that collective governance. But this is not as effective as we want because of the factors I have mentioned earlier, the issue of sovereignty, but also the interest of individuals and groups. We have, somebody yesterday has referred to the UN Security Council. We all expect the UN Security Council to be the main principal body to deal with issues of international peace and security. Efforts have been done, but its effectiveness is not full because of you all know the differences between members of the Security Council and the fact that the Security Council is not representative of the reality of the world today. its composition is rather obsolete. It reflects a reality that prevailed some decades ago, but not today. So in that sense, its legitimacy to act is to some extent limited. That's why the colleague yesterday, I think it's for Oxfam, saying that you should not count on these institutions, you should rely on yourself. And the need, therefore, of important involvement of civil society. Yes, the governments have their role, regional and universal organizations, they have their role, but civil society, nothing can be achieved if civil society is not fully involved. I personally realized that when in the early 90s we started the transformation of the OEU to the African Union, that I saw the limits of governments to move for the good, common good of Africa. That's why we promoted civil society, which is today in Africa has a voice which did not exist some 20 years ago in the continent. I was therefore very pleased with the emergence of a strong youth movement in Western Europe calling for immediate, urgent action to address the issue of climate change. But in my view, we cannot de-link their strong demand for urgent action to advance climate change from the prevailing economic and consumption model that has contributed to this global warming and climate change. It's a consequence of the economic system that we have now, the global warming, and our sister earlier mentioned the role of transnational corporations and the group of pressure, so to make sure that their interests are pursued, unfortunately, at the expense of global warming. In my view, therefore, addressing global warming and climate change requires that some serious reflection should be given to the current economic and consumption model, which is just unsustainable. In my view, the current level of consumption, overconsumption, is just not sustainable. We have seen the consequences on environment, but the consequences also on health and the consequences on relations, social relations. As a result of that, the impact of climate change is not felt equally by all. Those who are least responsible for climate change will most likely suffer more from its consequences. Those who are responsible for global warming and climate change will likely adapt better than those vulnerable ones. This is the principle of injustice, climate injustice, that was brought about by the whole discussion on these issues. Poor and developing countries in Africa and Asia who contribute very little to global warming will suffer more. We have all followed on the news the series of drought and floods in Asia and in Africa. And unfortunately, these poor countries are not in position to adjust and adapt to this kind of catastrophes. In addition, their capacity to adapt, as just said, is very limited. For instance, with a population of 17% of the global population, African contribution to global warming is estimated by experts at 3 to 4%. Imagine the impact of Africa on global warming if it pursues the path of industrialization and bearing in mind that the population of the continent will be 40%, is estimated to be 40% in 2100, if they pursue the full industrialization to reach the level of Europe. Imagine that, 40% with the level of pollution as it is in Europe, you see how the damage for global warming. So this is important. So what should be done? Shall we ask Africa to suspend its development, its industrialization, so that it will not contribute to the global warming, while other countries have developed at the expense of global warming and environment in the past? We have this debate. You have seen recently the controversy between Brazil and the president of Brazil and the president of France. This is a serious debate. Of course, for us, climate change and preserving climate change, addressing climate change is pivotal, is central to the humanity. But still, development is a requirement by all people. Every people is entitled to development. It is very often at the expense of environment, unless you find alternative ways of developing without affecting as much, with minimum effect on global warming. So this is one issue. Imagine if Africa, 30% population, in the next few years will have the same level of development as Europe. Second example. The Congo Basin. The Congo Basin is an area that covers essentially the Democratic Republic of Congo and spreads over Congo, Brazzaville, and many other Central African countries in Africa. Is the second largest tropical rainforest in the world. It is also the world's largest tropical peatlands, covering 145,500 square kilometers, the size of England, which serves as an atmosphere, an absorption carbon sink for greenhouse gases. Scientists say that they could store 3 years' world total fuel emission. Imagine again, if that forest of the basin of the Congo Basin forest is destroyed for economic purposes, because they want to develop, as it is happening in Brazil. The greenhouse gases will be released, and this by itself will totally undermine the objective of the Paris Conference, only if we destroy the forest in that part of Africa, in Central Africa. This will completely undermine our objectives as set in the Paris Conference. So it's clear that the impact of climate change will affect us all anyway, both developed countries and underdeveloped countries, poor and rich, men and women, old generations and new generations. That's why there is a need for working together. There is a need for solidarity. Without entering into the debate of the climate debt owed by the industrialized world to the global south, I mentioned that because the industrialized world is largely responsible for the global warming, while the south is not developed, is not industrialized, has not contributed to global warming. So there is a kind of debt, climate debt to them. But it is also a climate debt by the industrialized nations to future generations, because they're undermining future generations' life. So there is a debt. Actually, we are breathing the oxygen of future generation. So it's a huge debt. We need, at the end, I prefer to talk about solidarity between the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries, between these generations and these generations and the future generations. There is a need for greater solidarity. But despite this solidarity that we call, we know that it's limited because of the vested interest of some individual groups and some nations. We know that to achieve the goals will be difficult. That's why I agree with the colleague who just spoke earlier that we need to remain mobilized. This will require the continued engagement of citizens. And we need to also involve the elected representative of the citizens, not only at national level and regional, but also at local level. And I believe that the local authorities have not very much heard and involved in all this debate, and we need increasingly to get the local authorities involved. We have seen that how a decision taken by a president of the US can be changed by decision taken by mayors. So I think it's important to work with mayors, and lastly, I believe that the youth continued engagement is critical, and I would like to humbly associate myself with their movement and their cause. Thank you very much.